Hello, it's another video from your boy Cryo Golden, coming at you with new Moonrise spoilers. Now I'm recording this at 2:30 a.m. uh Wednesday night or Thursday morning, however you want to think about it. But I wanted to wait until after the all the lunar phases got spoiled so I can talk about all of them because I am super excited for the lunar phases. Now, I will say after all the spoilers, I think they have been kind of hit or miss. There's been some really high highs and some really low lows. Um, for me specifically, you can think I'm like a little pessimistic with some of these, but some of these I'm kind of disappointed in. We'll talk about it more once we get to the specific cards I was looking at because there are some really good cards and then there's some really not as good cards. But let's get right into it. The first card I want to talk about is Werepup. Werepup. It searches for a lunar phase, and then when you cast Full Moon, it it special ascends into the Like a Void. Similar to like the ones in the past. You know, this is kind of like a Nexus form of like Ampup and whatnot. Um, It is a 3/2, 1 cost, and the stats are kind of meh. I think it's kind of one of those things where it just self fulfills. I think the idea of how it would be used is basically you go Werepup, search Full Moon, set Full Moon, um, on your opponent's turn, activate Full Moon, enchant it with 2, throw Like a Void on top of it, and bada bing, bada boom, you got a Like a Void. Now, we don't know what Like a Void looks like. It might be good, it might be bad, we don't know yet. I'm planning to do, instead of like a bunch of videos every day for releases, I'm planning just to do every Thursday. I'm going to release everything from the last time I spoke, which is this Wednesday, to next Wednesday. I get to know things ahead of time because I am a backer, obviously, of Alestral's Clash, which I'm super excited about. I'm really into Alestral's. I'm super excited about Clash. I have been waiting for it. I am one of the higher tier members. I subscribe. I backed for 1,000, so I'm getting the alpha, the beta, and all that stuff. That also means I'm also getting 8 boxes that um I'm looking to probably open on stream. I'm gonna probably do a really long stream. I'm probably gonna open all the boxes on there and we'll see what we pull. That sounds pretty exciting. But on to the next card. Doppelgator is the next card. This is a 5/4, the 2 cost. It's the one that evolves from Nabi. So it goes Nabi to Doppelgator, right? So we got Doppelgator. It's a 5/4, 2 cost, right? Alestrals are not Alestrals that are not lunar or solar enchanted get -1 attack for each lunar enchanting this Doppelgator. Now that effect alone is pretty good. You know, it's kind of like it kind of like turns off fives. You know, and a lot of other stuff. I think the only fives that doesn't turn off is Spectaris and Lumaru. All the other fives get kind of snuffed out by it. When this doppelganger receives one or more lunar wind in a nexus, specifically in a nexus, you can special ascend it into Fulgorix from your hand or deck. Now we'll talk about Fulgorix in a second, but this seems pretty interesting. You know, it kind of gives it away. You know, it gives it almost a bit of a splashability, because of the fact that since it's lunar or wind and then lunar or solar, right? You can then combine them, right? You can use it in like a wind solar deck kind of thing, right? Which is interesting. I don't really think that like dedicated 2 color decks are that great outside of like a very few decks. I think most decks are like really like in one color and then splashes the other however many colors, right? I think most decks are like 5 or 6 colors because they're running the cryoblasts, they're running specteruses, dense fogs, they're running tsunamis, they're running eddies, they're running earthquakes sometimes, lava liths sometimes. Like a lot of decks tend to run a lot. Most decks run uh, Elichick, Jolton, and or Ash Rabbit. Most of the time, Ash Rabbit's the one that's mostly played, and the other two, get C play in other in like more Nexusy kind of decks, right? And for better or for worse, that's kind of how the game works. Uh, so I think Doppelganger kind of will either see like some interesting play in maybe a wind, like this line will probably see some play in like a dedicated wind deck with this as an additional win con, or a, because honestly the 2 cost could just be a win con in of itself, right? um just from that, like that one effect, I mean it's pretty great. It does lower your own Celestial stuff, but you can also just, sit on a Go- doppelganger, right? Seems pretty good. I think this card will probably, because of that, see more play in a dedicated Lunar deck, uh, and it'll probably go from there. Maybe like a Lunar Solar deck, but then it like doesn't like super synergize. It's kind of weird, how it's kind of trying to get you to play like three, like almost like a tricolor deck, like a dedicated tricolor deck, and I'm not exactly sure how well that's going to work out. But anyways, let's move on to Fulgurix, and this will give us more of a bigger picture, right? Elestrals that are not Lunar Solar Enchanted get -5 attack. You can Nexus, so it does have a Nexus ability on it to Nexus a Lunar or Wind. When Fulgurix receives one or more Lunar or Wind, in a Nexus, and specifically a Nexus, you can target your opponent's card and put it on the bottom of your deck. So it gets around a lot of like the can't be destroyed or can't be returned, like Farrageist and things like that. It does target, which is a little unfortunate, but -5. I mean that makes it extremely hard for things to hit over it, even though it's only a 10-6, right? It's certainly an interesting card. I would like to see it. I would like to see people test with it. I would love to see people test with it. I think this would be really cool in like a dedicated lunar lunar Nexus deck. Maybe. It would be kind of cool to see. I don't know if this is necessarily what the payoff is going to be for Lunar Nexus. Maybe it'll be something that people like hard ascend into, like maybe run it as like a one of hard ascend into it. Or maybe it might be a payoff for doing nexusing things, I think Posthumous would probably be a little bit better just because you got Artemis, right? But that's something that's to be seen, right? We don't know. I would like to see what happens. Obviously things can change depending on what new lunar cards come out, because all we know is like Draking, Drakid, Artemis, Specteris, Dense Fog, a lot of like suppression stuff. Which, a side note, just like an aside, I'm really enjoying Lunar specifically, and Solar. Solar also does this a lot. Which the other elements don't do as much, is they have like a specific thing that they do, right? Like Solar has Foretell. You know, they do a lot of stuff with Foretell over and over again. Um, and you don't really see. I don't think there's a single card in another element that foretells. In you'll see here in a few in later on, there is one lunar card that does foretell, but that's fine. It's fine that like this like Solar like hones in on it, and like sometimes it'll be like thrown on other cards and other elements, but like Solar, like you build around that in Solar, which I think is very interesting. Now the thing is, is Lunar, which I think is probably going to be one of my favorite, either that or Earth, just because there seems to be a lot of Earth decks that I really enjoy. But there's a lot of I really like the suppression mechanic. It's super cool. I love that it's like more of like specifically a lunar thing. Like lunar really goes in on it. I think that's super interesting. I think it's super cool. I also really like how uh they do a lot of stuff with it. It's not necessarily a control thing where like they're just suppressing you to make sure you can't do anything and then they go in and just like don't do anything, like can't kill you. I like how it's kind of like used to try to get in for damage. It's like you suppress them and then just hit them like a bunch. I think it's super cool. I think a really interesting card is kind of making Specteris your boss monster, and kind of building on Specteris, making Specteris huge by suppressing your opponent's Celestrals, right? Maybe even suppressing some of your own Alestrals, making Specteris bigger, swinging in, and then, passing, they stop being suppressed and whatnot, right? It's very interesting. It's very cool. I like the identity that Solar has. I like the identity that Lunar has. I like that they have identity versus a lot of the other colors, which kind of seem like they all kind of do the same stuff. They all have the same tools. None of them really have anything super specific. Thunder kind of has like a lot of discard where the other ones don't. Fire. I want to say fire has burn, but I mean like every color kind of has burn as much as fire does. It's not really specific to fire because wind also has burn, water, earth, like they all have burn. So like I can't even say that's supposed to be for that. I mean like, eh, like they don't really have much else, right? Um, but on top of that, I just really like it. I hope that they start building upon that with the other colors. They kind of look at them and go, I wonder what these other colors could do, like what they can kind of flourish into. I think that would be really cool, and I'm really excited to see what the future holds. Now, the next card is Blistrix. Now, this is a 3 cost. It's a 12/6. It is 2 frost and a wind, whereas Fulgurix was 2 lunar and a wind, and the other ones were all exclusively lunar. Now, Blisterix is also very interesting. When this Blisterix is sent from your deck to your underworld, you can special ascend your Asprowl to it, which is kind of a weird wording, but basically it means if you have an Asprowl, which is a card we haven't seen yet, you can special ascend the Blistrix onto it. Now, it's kind of weird that you have to specifically do it onto that. Also, the fact that you have to have a lot of like very specific things, and then the next text is you return 3 Alestrals from your underworld to the bottom of your deck in any order to destroy a card. Now, mind you, that's non-targeting destruction, which is super cool, especially with cards that can't be targeted, which is really annoying. But I think it's really cool end boss. I mean, it's not the biggest one. I mean, it's a 12/6, but I mean, let me tell you, I don't think there's really many 1 or 2 costs that's beating over it, if any at all, without at least some sort of setup to get there. Um, but yeah, I think this is a really cool card. I don't know exactly how playable it is. It really depends on how playable Asprowl is. If Asprowl is a really good card, then this card could also be really cool because it is Frost, which Frost is a very like mill heavy thing. Which it gives it kind of an identity. Going back to what I was saying before, Frost is kind of like the mill archetype, even though they kind of did some mill stuff with like Humburst and stuff, which they kind of gave that to 2 different things, but Frost kind of goes a lot more into it, and I think is becomes a lot more dedicated for like self mill. Whereas like the other one, you can separate it and say the other ones were like mill your opponent, while the Frost kind of mills yourself, which is that's something, right? The next one is Havacub. I've heard people kind of like this card. I don't think it's really that good. It's not a 5, it's a 4/3. And it's a one cost 4/3, and it can't nothing can make it change its position. Nothing your opponent can do can make it change its position. And I just don't think that's really that good. I mean, I've heard people say it's a counter to Eddie, even though they're both 4s, so they just crash, killing both of them. So I mean, I guess you get rid of the Eddie, like the Eddie's forced to trade, right? But like, man, I, j- I mean, I guess it's also immune to tsunami, but it's also a 4. Like the thing is, it's like it's a really good, but it's a 4, and it doesn't really advance it. So my issue with it is it doesn't advance a game plan. It's just a card on the field, and it doesn't really, and it's not like so big to where you're like, ah, well, I have to deal with this somehow because I can't beat over it, right? Like, it dies to everything. It doesn't advance any sort of game plan. I guess you could say it's like a little aggressive. Uh, but I really just don't see it seeing much play because basically every 5 is really better than it. Because I mean, the only thing is it dies to It doesn't die to, well, it does die to Eddie. Still, like that's the problem, right? It still dies to Eddie. It just also kills the Eddie also. Whereas, like, I mean, I guess it's a little better, right? Even though really you could just argue that it's like, well, they trade, and then if you play a 5, then I guess you get in for like one more spirit, which I mean is something, right? Whereas, well, if you were just gonna play a 5 anyways, I mean that kills the Eddie also. So like, what's really like the difference there, right? I'm not super, and I mean it doesn't die to cryoblast. Also, I mean it is a 3 defense, right? It's a 4/3. So I guess that's also something. I don't know. I don't think it's really that good. I don't think it's gonna really have a home anywhere because I don't think it's good enough to go in 5s. The most I can see is maybe like a sideboard option if you're going up against like a water deck, right? And you're having to deal with Eddie. Maybe then you go. It's like, oh well, I'm dealing with like drag hit. Well, even if you're dealing with drag hit, I mean they just swap and then kills it. But I mean like if you're dealing with like an Eddie deck, right? Then you could just you could you could try to do something there. I don't know. I don't really think it's that good, but I guess that's remained to be seen. That's my opinion, though. Hurricane Invoke Rune. That's a wind, thunder, water spirit. Destroy all face down runes. Now with Gloombat, right? A lot of people are going to be setting only one face down rune. Uh, Also with a lot of with a lot of people say to play optimally, you only really need to set one face down anyways, right? That's your that's like the best way to play. Which makes it really hard for me to justify ever playing Hurricane. Maybe it's something that you play at the very beginning, right? When people aren't really like accustomed to that, they set their whole back row and they pass, and then you can blow them out with Hurricane, right? Get a 3 for 1. That can happen, but you're not really seeing that a lot of the time, because I mean, a lot of back row is kind of how the meta is right now. I think this card only gets worse as back row becomes less relevant, unless this game takes a different direction and back row becomes more relevant. I would love for back row to stay relevant through the entire time. Unlike Yu-Gi-Oh, where back row became super irrelevant, and most of the time, if your back row isn't searchable or usable immediately, it's bad. Um, like Infinite Impermanence sees play because you can use it on the first turn. I mean, you can. It's a hand trap, quite literally. Um, and I just don't think this card's gonna really see any play. I don't think it's really gonna do anything unless back row becomes crazy and people start playing multiple of the back row, and then this card gets kind of popular, and then it kind of goes on a sine wave, right? Same thing with Gloombat. Gloombat is very much the same way. I think Gloombat is still a fantastic card. I think it's a great sideboard option over something like maybe like Thunderstorm, where like Gloombat, it's one cost versus two, which is huge. Uh, and it's like solar. So like in solar decks, like that card goes great. Maybe in like a thunder deck, maybe you still run Thunderstorm because you still want your normal, right? I think Gloombat is still worth it if something like Zeus is an issue. Like, you're running against Vol Tempest and you have to get rid of Zeus, and like you don't really have you don't really have like the spirit deck to be playing freaking two or four thunderstorms, right? Um, like the four zapped, like the two or four zaptor for thunderstorm, right? You run the two for the three copies of Gloombat. I and Hurricane, I just don't see any place for it because if you want to run three of it, you're gonna have to take up six spaces in your in your spirit deck. If you want to splash it, it's basically unsplashable. You would have to play it in one of these three color decks, and I just don't think it's that great. I don't think it's worth the four extra spirits that it's gonna have to cost. Right? I just don't think it's that good. And that's just kind of how the cookie crumbles, to be honest. But moving on, we're gonna go to Hypnosm. Hypnosm is all right. You know what? I'm not gonna rain on its parade too hard. It floats, right? Like a card, it's a 1/1, right? But it floats. So like you can like kind of just defense position on turn one. They crash into it. You recast it, right? And it recasts in attack position misenchanted, right? So you can't keep doing it unless you like go like re-enchanted or something, right? Which I guess you could go like special ascend into like if you go Hypnosm turn one, they crash into it, you get it back, and then you go turn two, you like hard ascend into like something else. That's pretty good, right? You can like misenchant it with like let's say it's like a dual color thing. You can misenchant it with the other color, and then you can just put the second color for the lunar, and then there you go. Right? This card has uses. I don't know exactly how well people are going to use it. I don't think it's really going to see super much play, right? Not like the it's not crazy. But it definitely has applications, and I think it would be interesting to at least play around with, see what you can do with it. Ectoplasm, I think, is more of a card that you would actually maybe try to actually use. I think this card could actually see some meta play, because when it's sent from hand or deck to the underworld, I can expend a lunar to special cast it with and enchant it with two lunars. Right, that's pretty good. And by special enchant it with two lunars, right? Just just to be clear, right? It's not like it gets four spirits immediately. It's just the two. It just has to specifically be the two lunar. I think it's definitely something because you can definitely like turn one special ascended and then immediately hit it with like Pharaohgeist, right? You can get a turn one Pharaohgeist, get a turn one Fulgurix, because it is two lunar, and then you just got the wind, right? You can immediately get into like three costs like that. When I think that's super good. Um, I think this would go in like a frost deck, honestly. How I've heard of it, because like you have to like self mill. Unless there's a card to like, unless they like print like a foolish burial esque card, right? Something that just immediately sends like a lunar card, or something that immediately sends in like a two cost celestial, or a lestral of any kind, which I think would be insane. I don't think they should print that, even though really Ectoplasm is the only one that really takes advantage of it. besides maybe a few other cards like a Morfrost. Like Morfrost would actually probably love a card that just immediately sends, right? Um, but Ectoplasm would also, I mean, that would be like a really cool card. You run like one Ectoplasm, three of the burial card of the Foolish Burial, and then you just send it, right? Which it's something. I think this card definitely will see some. Well, some people will definitely see it. You know, you could also do like golden apples with it. I think it's very interesting. I've been brewing a kind of reanimator kind of deck, and I think Ectoplasm might find some room in there. Next, we'll move on to Toxery. So this is the Nexus form of like Toxion and stuff like that. Uh, I will say it's a 2/4. Oh, by the way, the Ectoplasm is a 3/3, right? So the stats aren't great unless you're like playing like a threes list, but also it's a 2 cost 3, so it's like kind of like, you know. But moving on to Toxery, it's a 2/4, which it's all right stats. You know, I think the same as the other ones, so you know, not bad. When you cast it, it tutors a dense fog, which really cool, very interesting. And then suppress celestials get -2/-2. Really cool. I really like that. You know, I kind of wish it would do something similar to Cryoblast, where it's like if the defense hits 0, it dies. But honestly, I'm originally a Magic player. In my opinion, which I know a lot of people don't necessarily agree with that. They like the combat. I think the combat is still fun. I just prefer Magic combat over the Yu-Gi-Oh style of combat. I think it would be a lot cooler if, you know, they're trading that way. But that's just me. This is that's just my opinion. I just like the Magic style better. I wish a little bit. I would like to see how this game would be if they decided to go that way. But this is completely fine. I enjoy this game immensely this way, anyways. But I'm just saying, it does get -2/-2, which I mean is a big difference, right? I mean, it still makes like fives turn to threes, right? And if you do like a dense fog the whole field, everything gets -2/-2, and then you can just kind of beat in with stuff, right? Excuse me there, sorry. And I mean, it tutors the dense fog right there. I mean, you could do combat tricks with it. Very cool. Um, and just just want to thank A Drive personally and the whole Illustrals team for making it not a burn card. I am so happy it's not a Toxion and it doesn't burn you every time it receives a spirit. I'm just thankful every day that I don't have to read Expend a Spirit for them just nexusing. It's just amazing. I'm so happy. Thank you so much. I I hope that A Drive sleeps well, knowing he did not print yet again another burn card. Night of Venom, I've heard a lot of people not so happy about. It is a 2 cost 6/6. You know, it is supposed to be the next form of the Toxery, right? You can discard a Dense Fog in order to target and destroy up to 2 cards. So it does target, but it destroys 2. You know, that is a 2-for-1, right? That is pretty good. And then while you have at least 2 dense fog in your underworld, it cannot be the target of my opponent's invoke runes. The invoke runes is part is really good because I mean wasting a normal summon on it feels a little bad, but I mean it is a 6/6 cost, so I mean boom batting it is pretty good, but you know, it forces them to do that versus over just EQ, right? Um Also on top of that, it it is like a 6 body, so it's extremely hard to do. Eddie can't get over it because it's a 6/6. It can't be cryoblast, so I mean like even if like you didn't have the 2 dense fog, I mean you would have to have basically EQ or laurels, and this has to be the only thing on the field, or you have to have a 3 cost on the field, and then which case you would rather target the 3 cost. So I mean this is I've heard a lot of people not really like this card. I think it's very interesting. I can see why people won't like it, just because if you are kind of running a lunar deck, you kind of want to just set the dense fog and suppress your opponent's Celestrals. I think it could have a place, maybe in certain decks, maybe like an aggressive form of a lunar deck, in which case you need to do it, or maybe a control version. Actually, I think in a control version would be a lot better, where maybe Dense Fog is a decent option, but maybe you would rather just pop 2 cards, right? And it turns into a body that can be your beater, and it gains protection on it also. It kind of has like it's like the inverse of the Wasp Ivy, right? I think it's really interesting. I really like this card. I think it could find a home, possibly. I think people would definitely have to do some testing with it, and people would have to play around with it. Um, but I would like to see if it does go anywhere, or if it just falls to the wayside. I mean, who really knows until people have it in their hands and they're playing with it, and so like until next year we won't know. But it's definitely something to keep in mind. Moving on to Voldusk. So now we're getting into more of the lunar phase cards. Now, the Voldusk line is probably what I am most excited about. Mostly because it is just a dark, dark psychic Vulpix. And I love Vulpix. I think Vulpix is a super cool Pokemon. Uh, Also a Pokemon nerd. Yeah, I know. I've played many TCG. It's kind of crazy. I mind you, with Pokemon, I played more of the games. I more like the VCG, to be honest, or the VGC. Excuse me. I digress. Voldusk is a 1/5, so it's a 5. Love fives. When you cast a Lunar Phase, so any of those 8 title cards, right? We'll get to those in a second. You can draw a card or heal one. Heal one Lunar, right? And it can only be activated twice each turn. So, it does have a restriction. It's I think they got pretty scared with Drataya. I will say a lot of these cards feel like overcorrections of cards from the past. Like it feels like they overcorrected a little bit too much, in my opinion. I feel like a lot of these cards could be better, but they didn't want to make them better, because they were really afraid of having another Drataya. I don't think Voldusk would be another Drataya if it was twice each turn. It only draws 1 card or heals 1, right? Half of the I will say now, half of the Lunar Phase cards are counter runes. So you couldn't even do them all in one turn. You could only theoretically do up to 4. Um, we'll say why and kind of how that's would be kind of impossible later on. Impossible in air quotes. I mean, literally, it's possible if you ran 3 of each one. We'll talk about why we wouldn't later on. Uh, not to say that this isn't a great card. It's a 1/5. It has a big butt that you can sit on, and it makes it extremely hard to hit over. And I love this card. I think this card is going to be very good. And I mean, like, you could sit there and heal all day, and your opponent can't really do much unless they're gonna, like, use like a invoke rune, or they're going to immediately PTA it, right? But I really like this card. I'm super excited. This will be one of the decks. I promise you. I know I've kind of started being known as kind of a Wasp Ivy player, but I think this will be my next deck that I'm going to be super in on. I think I'm going to do both of them really hard. I'm super into Lunar. Lunar is probably my favorite element. It's just so good. We're gonna move on to the first Lunar Phase card. We're gonna do Lunar Phase New Moon. You can target an Celestial in the field and suppress it until the end phase, right? It's a 1 cost Invoke rune. You may expend Lunar equal to the target's enchantment cost, and then discard a Lunar Phase. If you do, destroy it. So, I will say I really genuinely like all the Invoke runes that are lunar phases. I think they're all really good. Lunar phase, I think, it's a one cost, right? So if you destroy, so if you're trying to destroy another one cost, it's basically just an EQ that suppresses first. Now, I will say the only thing I don't like about this card is that it says target. It's it's kind of upsetting to me that there is very few cards that don't say target that aren't just like cards you can run for things like Voltempest, because Voltempest has been something that's cropping up more and more since the new ban list, and because of that, Voltempest is extremely hard to hit over because it's a 14 body, and not to mention they don't need to swing. It burns you for 3 every turn. So it's really frustrating to sit there and having to deal with like a back row Zeus and then having a Voltempest just sit there and do whatever the hell it wants, to be honest. I mean, this card's already gonna what expend 4 to try to get rid of it. I mean, it's gonna cost 1, and then you have to expend another 3 to get rid of it, but it targets, so it doesn't even work. I just think that they could have made this card not say target, and this card would be awesome. I think it would be really cool. I mean, it could see sideboard play in other decks, even though it is very lunar intensive. But I mean, like with something that is a card that will deal with Voltempest, I think it's definitely worth it. I mean, I mean, paying 4 to kill a Voltempest, I mean, that's still a high cost, right? I I don't know. That's just my opinion on it, but I strongly feel that it really didn't need to say target. But moving on, we'll go to Volumbra. So this is the next form of Voldusk, right? When you discard a lunar phase during your main phase, you can special ascend your Voldusk uh, to this Volumbra from your hand. When you cast a lunar phase full moon, you can special ascend the Volumbra into the Volclipse. That is very cool. It feels like it's a 5/7 body, by the way. It's a 2 cost 5/7 body. So it's a big boy. It's one of the bigger 2 cost cards, right? Uh and it has to specifically be in hand to be able to special ascend, right? And then the other one, just you can actually it says special ascend specifically from the deck. So if the Volclipse is in your hand, I mean, you're gonna have to hard ascend into it, which I guess isn't that big of a deal, right? I mean, if it's already in your hand, you just waste a normal, which isn't like the worst thing in the world, right? And we'll get to what that card does too, because that card is also top notch. I really enjoy that card. But this card, it's very cool. I actually really like this card. I think it does have that 2 cost kind of middling feeling, which I think a lot of 2 costs have. I think 2 costs kind of fall into this they're either really good or really not good. Where it's either they're really good because they do something and they like have like a use and they like can perform utility function, or they're not so good because all their utility is basically just getting you to the 3 body, which has that kind of your one special like in Yu-Gi-Oh, your Link 1 special summons another monster which gets you to your Link 2, which then special summons another monster which then gets you to your Link 3, which special summons another monster to get you to your Link 4, and so on and so forth. It has that like, well, this the only point of this is like your 3 costs are meant to be harder to get into, but you know the whole point of the 2 costs is just specifically to get you to the 3. So is there really like a cost? It has that kind of issue with it. I will say, Alestrials has it to a much lesser extent because there is an actual cost. There is an actual cost to it. I mean, you have to perform a specific action. You have to do the full moon, right? You have to like actually cast the full moon to get this effect, which I think is which I think makes it much better than having just, oh yeah, your splash mage special summons one from the grave to then get you to your transcode talker, which then special summons your splash mage back to get you your 5, right? It doesn't have that issue. I mean, it actually, like, you know, has to, like, do something else. It doesn't just, like, it's not just facilitated by the fact that you had to link summon, so there is in fact the thing in the grave for you to special summon, right? So that's interesting. Moving on, we'll move on to Volclipse. Volclipse is a 6/12 that is a 3 lunar. It gets +1 for each different title among lunar phases in your underworld. So it can be up to 6 plus 8 is a 14, correct? Yes, a 14. So this can, by itself, it could just crash into a Volt Tempest to get rid of it if you have all 8. So that's interesting. But it doesn't sound like you're going to need to do it because the second effect is you can shuffle 8 Lunar's phase with different titles from your underworld into your deck in order to return your opponent's field to their hand. So you just put the whole thing back. You just say nope, goodbye, and you put their whole field back into their Zeus, everything, and then their spirits all go to grave. So I mean, like, if Volt Tempest does hit the field, I mean, you just do it back. Nexus decks, goodbye to like all their spirit investment. I mean, like, this, I mean, they still get their cards back, right? They can still replay them, but they lose all their spirit investment, which I think is very nice. I think it's very cool, and it requires a lot of setup, so it doesn't necessarily feel bad. It's like, well, my opponent, worked for this, and I mean, like, there should be a payoff for that. It The only thing is no protection, so I mean, like, it can get PTA'd, right? But I mean, hey, they have to pay for that, and they don't, and now they have to reset up. I mean, that's pretty tough. So I think this is a very cool card. I'm really excited. I am definitely going to try to build a lunar phase deck, and I'll try Werepup probably as more of a tutor than actually the Like a Void, depending on how good the Like a Void is. But I think I'm gonna focus more on the Volclip stuff, definitely. Now we're gonna get into the actual lunar phase stuff. We're gonna start off with the counter runes, and we're gonna end with the other 3 invoke runes because I want to get past the not so good and then end on a good note, right? Let's go. So we'll start off with lunar phase waxing crescent. We're just gonna say the title. We're not gonna go through the lunar phase this, lunar phase that. We're just gonna call it the title. So waxing crescent, counter rune, target a lunar enchanted celestial and give it +1 until the end phase for each lunar phase in all underworlds, right? So it counts your opponent too. But it requires a little bit of setup. It is a 2 cost, which I'm actually now realizing. I guess in my head I always thought it was a 1 cost just because I thought it should be, but it's a 2 cost. It it has to be a lunar enchanted celestial, and it gets +1 for each lunar phase in all underworlds, right? So it requires setup. It's expensive, and it's specific. I mean, realistically, it's not really a restriction. This card is only really going to see play in lunar decks, right? I mean, I guess you can't do it to your Astrabbit. You can't make your Astrabbit huge and then swing in or whatever. But I mean, like, this is what I mean. A lot of the counter runes kind of feel like this. They kind of feel super overcorrected. Like, don't poke the bear was really good, and I guess they thought it was a bit too good, and then they made lunar phase, which is, it feels like a worse don't poke the bear. Because here, actually, I think I have one somewhere over here that I could read just to refresh all of our memories, right? Don't poke the bear. 1 cost counter rune. This don't can only be cast during the battle phase. Target a bear and give it +4/+4 until the end phase, right? No setup, 1 cost, and the only really restriction is it has to be in the battle phase. To be honest, you wouldn't cast until after you've already declared the attack if you're playing optimally, because you would wait until the very last second to use it to kind of feign your opponent, right? You like you set it. You set it on your turn. You wait for your opponent to swing into you, and then you hit this with them, and then they go, oh well, they got blown out, right? Their thing dies, and then you might get in for damage depending on if this is on a full clips or whatnot, right? But it's two cost. I mean, like, yeah, if you set everything up right, there's 8 in there and it gets +8, but realistically, you're getting like +3, +4 by the time you're actually casting Lunar Phase. Because to be honest, I would run this at a 1, maybe 2 of at most. I would not run it at more than that. I mean, it's just really spirit intensive for what it does. I mean, it's just, I just don't think it's that great. Uh, but it's one of the more playable ones. I will give it that. I mean, like it is a good effect. It's just kind of expensive, is all I'm saying, and requires a kind of a. It's hard to say a lot of setup because it is just lunar. It actually does say just lunar phases. It doesn't say different titles. So I mean, like if you just start just like tossing a bunch in, I mean, like you could actually get it up to like 4 or 5 fairly easy. But it does still require setup. I mean, you can't just set this and it does something, right? You have to set this and then actually like do stuff in order for it to actually mean anything. But it is one of the more playable ones. I will give it that. Moving on to first quarter. It is a counter rune and it's just draw a card. That's the whole effect. It is Jar of Greed. And it does have a second effect. I will give it. Hold on. You may discard a lunar phase to return a Voldusk, Full Umbra, or Volclipse to your underworld to your hand. So it's some recursion. So it draws a card, and it's some recursion, and it's neutral at best. Uh, because you have to discard a lunar phase, and then to get the recursion, and then draw a card. It is one cost, so it's not like they overcosted it this thing, but it's also not that great. Let's see. Circle the Sky. I mean, no Nexus decks run Circle the Sky. It's kind of like that card that you kind of go, oh, okay, well, everything's in my deck, and then you put Circle the Sky in it at first, and then you're like, well, I need room for this, and then you kind of sit there and you're like, well, Circle the Sky is just not as good as Alter. So you take out Circle the Sky, and that's just kind of how it is. It doesn't just draw a card, doesn't really do much. I mean, I will say, versus other card games, draw a card is this in this game is kind of pretty good. Uh, but I really just don't think it's good enough to facilitate actually just running this at more than a one of because it's required. And that's kind of how I feel about most of the counter runes, is where it feels like, well, I run the one of because it's required for Volclipse's effect. And beyond that, it kind of feels like I really should not include it beyond that. And that's just kind of how it feels. But moving on, we'll go on to the Wax and Gibbous, which I think is probably the one that I'm most disappointed in. Because it has two protection effects that do not blend well together. Let me read this card to you. So it's a counter rune. So Wax and Gibbous. It's a counter rune. It is one cost lunar. Target a lunar enchanted celestial and change its position. Right? Which means unless you're facing like the mirror or maybe a lunar nexus kind of deck or something of that kind of sort, it's gonna be on your guys, right? That's the idea. You're gonna have a attack position of uh Voldusk, and then they'll swing in with like a 3 body or something, and then you go lunar phase and you switch it to defense to save it, right? But then the next effect is you may expend a lunar and discard a lunar phase, and if you do, the target celestial cannot be destroyed by card effects once this turn, which means like the next time it would be destroyed, it's not by card effects. Which I mean, it protects against such niche things. I mean, like my issue with this card is that the amount of like, if it's not protecting it, if the first effect is not protecting it, then the second effect has to. But then you have to switch the battle position, and it doesn't feel great, right? Like, if it it feels like Alter the Stars, right? But it feels like they thought Alter was too strong, so they overcorrected it and it became this card. But the thing is it can be stronger than Alter because it's A, not generic, and B, has a lot of restrictions, making it very lunar focused. I wish this card was better than Alter, quite honestly, because of the fact that you have to specifically build your deck around it. Cards that you have to build your deck around should be allowed to be stronger. They shouldn't be weaker. My issue with a lot of these counter runes, actually, we'll talk about the next one and then we'll get into it. So on to the next one. We got Full Moon, which is by far the best counter rune out of all of them. Enchant up to 2 Lunar onto your field. When this Lunar phase is discarded, you can foretell 3. So this is the one card in Lunar that we've seen so far that can foretell. And this is, I think, the only card outside of Solar that foretells at all, which I think is cool. I think I think it's cool that that some other cards can get it sporadically, like very little, and not as good as Lunar or as Solar. Excuse me. But I think it's cool that they're at least trying to give it to other stuff. So it's like, yeah, you can do it, but Solar can do it the best. This is by far probably the best one because you can either like sneakily get in for like 2 more damage on your opponent. You can then enchant it, and then if it's like the middle stage, which the name is escaping me at the moment. Volumbra. If you have like a Volumbra, you can just immediately enchant it with 2, and then bam, put that right on top of it. It doesn't really cost you anything extra. Um, yeah, but I mean, like, this is probably the best one. Followed by probably either Waxing Crescent or First Quarter, and then I think Waxing Gibbous is probably the worst. I think Waxing Gibbous is the worst by a decent margin, to be honest. Um, I just think my problem with all of the counter runes is that they don't replace any of the staples, right? So we have 15 to 20 staples that go in basically every deck. None of these cards replace them. Like, none of them are like a specific, like, none of them are a shield. None of them are a PTA. None of them are a Gorgons for specifically like a lunar. Like none of them is like a lunar Gorgons, right? Which I think would be like the best thing that they could replace. You know, like, it costs specifically 2 lunar, and let's say you have to control a lunar Alestral, or you have to have a certain amount of lunar phases in your grave, or you have to discard lunar phases for cost, which like a lot of them do. My issue with all of the counter runes is I feel like I am running the one of so that I can meet the Volclipse requirement, and beyond that, I hope that beyond that, they're discard fodder. Uh, I think especially Waxing Gibbous. I think I run the one to bin as quickly as possible, and I don't really ever set it. I don't feel like I would ever actually set this under like very fringe cases. Um, I'm very curious to see how other people feel because that's how I kind of feel about them. But I digress. We'll move on to the Invoke runes, which I think are miles better. I am very happy. I'm pretty happy with a lot of the Invoke runes. I think the first one we read, I believe it was New Moon. I think that one was pretty good. I was really happy with it. When I first saw it, I was like, when I first saw that one, it made me very excited about the rest. Then I saw the 4 counter runes, and it kind of stomped on my excitement. It made me very worried about the other 4. Then when I got to the other 3 Invoke runes, I was a lot happier. So let's go to Waning Gibbous, right? It's a 1 cost Invoke rune. Shuffle a Lunar Phase, Volumbra, or Volclipse from your hand or underworld into your deck in order to search your deck for a Voldusk and add it to your hand. So basically, Waning Gibbous, you just get a Voldusk. It puts a Voldusk into your hand. It's basically 3 more copies of Voldusk, so you have 6 copies of Voldusk, and it can kind of recycle. So this deck can kind of function as almost like a resource loop in itself, and also be like kind of like a control deck, which I think is really cool. It's like a game plan kind of control deck that sits there, and it recycles its resources, and it kind of loops itself to where you go, and then you can kind of keep going infinitely, right? But moving on to Final Quarter. Final Quarter is a 1 cost. Search your deck for up to 2 Lunar Phase and send them to the underworld. So this card just immediately bins 2, right? When this Lunar Phase is discarded by another Lunar Phase, you can return. It heals 1, right? I think another side tangent. I know I'm going on about this a lot. This video is going to end up being like over an hour, but I think just these like this card is one of the best ones. I think it's like the top 3, top 4. It's definitely in the better half of the lunar phases, but they designed this card in a way to make you think that it's one of the worst ones where you actually want to bin it. Um which is really strange to me because this card just reads your if you didn't draw the 2 worst lunar phases in your deck, you're never seeing them, which I think is fantastic. I think that makes this card really good because it also gets 3 lunar phases into your grave almost immediately. I mean, I guess you would run it like at like a probably at like a 2 or 3 of, right? And then the first one you do, and you're really excited about it. You may or may not cast the second one, and the third one is basically either you got your Volclipse and you've used its effect, so you want to bin the other 2 again to kind of jumpstart the Volclipse, getting back to Volclipse's stuff, or you've already gotten your aid, and you kind of hope to draw the other 2, in which case you discard it to one of your other lunar phases. So like I guess in that respect, I mean it is nice to be able to like heal one when you do it, but I mean it's one of the ones that you probably actually want to cast. Whereas something like waxing gibbous, right? It is one of the discard outlets. It's like one of the ones that you use to discard. It's almost like this is the one you actually want to play. Uh, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the design idea was that because the effect isn't that great, they wanted to give you the added benefit of that, whereas the other ones are really good, and they make you think twice about actually casting them, and maybe the idea is that it's trying to force you to make decisions, whereas my idea is like, well, this card's a cast is a card you want to cast, so it should have the second effect be a card that allows you to discard, and the other ones that aren't as good should be ones that have like the discarded, like if it's discarded then do X thing on them. But I guess it's kind of supposed to balance out, right? Like you have, because card good, then make decision to discard, and vice versa or whatnot. Then we'll go on to our final card. We'll go Waning Crescent. Now Waning Crescent, uh it's basically Ambro. This is basically an Ambrosia. It's just 1 lunar. Return up to 2 lunar from your underworld to your spirit deck. When this lunar phase is discarded by another lunar phase, draw a card, then discard a card. So it loots. Looting, draw a card, discard a card in Magic terms, right? Uh, but this is basically just a mini Ambro, right? This card I think is by far the best one. I think this card is the best one out of all of them. This card's amazing. I was talking with Kier XR Merrick about about what the next lunar phases could be, and a few days ago, I even said I was like, it would be really interesting if one of them is an Ambro to maybe help replace Ambro. Now, one of my problems is that it's return 2 while Ambro is return 3. And this one's specifically to Lunar, and I said it's like, well, it they could print Ambro, but specifically for Lunar to force Lunar decks to like make it so it can't be used in other decks unless they're like really specific, and two, so that Lunar gets like kind of like a cool resource engine. My issue with this card is I think the fact that it's returning less almost makes it better for other decks to use it because it only returns up to 2. You can use its full benefit in other decks because like let's say they run like a little bit more Lunar than other decks, right? It runs the Dense Fogs and the Spectaris, right? You've They played 2 Spectaris and they killed both of them. They can heal that now, right? They can use their 1 Lunar, heal 2, and then play them out, right? And it makes their spirit math a lot easier. I think it would have been better if they put 3. I think it would be a lot better if they said it's 1 cost, return 3. It says return 3, not up to 3, return 3. Like you have to have 3 in your grave to return it. That way, other decks really difficult for them to run it, especially if they're only running like 2 or 3 to begin with. And on top of that, in a Lunar deck, you're gonna use 3. Like this Lunar phase stuff is mostly runes. It's like a lot of runes, and you're going to be, burning a lot of those runes on stuff. I mean, like forcing you to return 3, specifically Lunar, I think would be way better. I think it, I think it would be much better that way. I don't think they're necessarily I don't think this deck will be weak. Uh, After everything is said and done, I think a lot of these cards are very cool. Overall, as much as I was being a little bit pessimistic about some of the counter runes, about some of the overcorrections that I think they did in these Lunar Phase cards, I think the deck will be very strong. As I said at the beginning of the video, I am going to play this deck. I'm going to brew it. I'm gonna hope to be one of the first people to brew it. I'm going to be taking this to many tournaments. I'm going to be on this deck. I think it's one of the coolest decks to come out, and I think it has an interesting payoff. It forces you to play a dedicated Lunar deck. It forces you to play to dedicate it to one color. Whereas a lot of these decks, they really don't force you to dedicate to a color. It Running a little bit more of that color versus others is gives you like some benefit, but for the most part, a lot of decks like they'll be like a little bit less than half of their spirit deck. Like it'll be like 7 to 9. Maybe like Nexus decks go up to closer to like 11, maybe at most. Um, in Nexus decks for like one color besides Solar. Solar is the one exception to this, where a lot of Solar, because of their foretell mechanic, and how it kind of is a lotto system, you do the same thing that tier limits did back in the day, where you ran as much of that archetype, or you ran as much Solar as possible to make sure you hit what you needed to hit, right? You ran the 3 of all the cards that you're trying to look for. And Solar kind of goes through their deck a lot the same way that tier limits did back in the day, but it's really cool. And actually, a better example would be Adamantipator. Adamantipator from Yu-Gi-Oh, where they excavate the top 5 and they're looking for rocks. So in Yu-Gi-Oh, you played a bunch of rocks that previously were unplayable until Adamantipator, and then they got all those rocks, and all those rocks became immediately a lot more playable because they needed to fill their decks with rocks so that they can special summon. All of that to say is I am extremely excited for Moonrise. I cannot wait for Moonrise. I am on the edge of my seat. I can't wait for Clash. I'm hoping that I don't know exactly how they're going to handle Clash, but I am hoping, crossing my fingers, that on Clash, on beta, on the alpha or the beta, they will have the Moonrise cards in there. Hopefully. We'll see. By the time I think Clash comes out, I think it'll be around the time that Moonrise comes out, anyways. So, I mean, they're probably going to need it in there anyways, so, I mean, they might as well, right? But yeah, I'm just super excited. I'm really looking forward to tomorrow's releases and everything beyond that. But yeah, besides that, I hope y'all have a great rest of your day. Let me know in the comments what you think about these cards. Let me know if you agree with me, disagree with me. If I missed any of the spoilers, I mostly was getting these off of the Kickstarter and the few that I've seen in the Celestial server. I probably have missed some because I know there was a leak and I wasn't really paying a lot of attention to the leak. I was kind of trying to shield myself from it. I wasn't feeling super because they didn't mean to do that. They weren't trying to leak those cards. I was trying to be a little respectful. I think they kind of don't really care. I think they were just kind of like, oh, my bad. Oh, well. But I don't know. I was just trying to be respectful. But, if there was anything I missed, let me know in the comments and I will cover them in the next one next week. Um, but yeah, besides that, let me know what you think. If you like the video, if you like it, if you didn't, dislike it, and let me know in the comments what you didn't like about it. Or let me know, or if you like it, let me know in the comments what you did like about it. And if you have been enjoying my content thus far, maybe think about dropping a subscribe. Uh, Share the video around. I really hope that this is very educational or very interesting at the very least to y'all, to hear my opinion and to kind of see what other people think in the community. I'm really excited to see what comes next. Yeah, have a nice rest of your day, because this video will probably come out later tomorrow on Thursday, whenever it comes out. See you later, guys. Sock it to you.